Of the 6.8 billion humans alive today, only 6 are able to observe the world from a totally new perspective. The crew members of the International Space Station. They travel right round the Earth once every 90 minutes. How much will change on our planet in that time? How far will the continents drift? How many trees will be cut down? And how many planted? How many times will lightning strike the Earth? And how much rain will fall? How many people will die? And just how many will be born? Gazing down from orbit, we will follow the unfolding story of the human race and of our world, and discover how much can change in just one 90-minute orbit. On the 12th of April 1961, Yuri Gagarin was blasted into space. Crammed into a tiny metal sphere traveling at 28,000 kilometers per hour, he was the first person to get a proper look at where we live. He was delighted with what he saw. "The Earth is blue," he shouted. "It's amazing." He was right. It is blue. The first thing an alien would notice about our planet took us 200,000 years to find out. From this moment forth, our perspective on the world had changed forever. We thought we were going to explore the universe, and yet the most extraordinary thing we discovered was our own home planet, the Earth.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Space flight allows you to take a step back and to see the world with fresh eyes. Suddenly, all the familiar things around us take on a new meaning, a new significance. So what would we see if we went on a trip round the world today?
BBC News at 9 o'clock. The government sends out its legislative...
We're starting our journey at Greenwich, close to London's docks. This is the historic heart of maritime Britain. The desire to travel and explore is part of human nature. For centuries, explorers set out from here in search of strange new worlds. Britain became so synonymous with global travel that when it came to deciding where the world's starting line should be, Greenwich won the honour. Not only is Greenwich Mean Time the time upon which all other time zones are based, but this line at the Royal Observatory is 0 degrees longitude, the place from where all the vertical lines of longitude which carve up the world are measured. On this imaginary orbit, we will be following these lines of longitude westward to explore some of the extraordinary places that lie along them. Every one of these lines takes their lead from here. This is the place that humankind has designated Go.
Of the Soyuz rocket to the International Space Station.
But these days, the people at the cutting edge of exploration don't set out in creaking wooden ships. They climb aboard blazing rockets and head to orbit.
Everything on board is nominal.
This rocket is heading towards the International Space Station, home to the people currently circling high above our planet.
The vehicle is now traveling at a speed of about 4,700 miles per hour.
Roughly every 6 months, a replacement crew is sent up from Earth.
Soyuz heading toward a link up with the International Space Station, now 20 meters from docking.
By the time the two craft dock, they are traveling at over 28,000 kilometers an hour.
Standing by for contact.
Okay. We have contact.
We have initial contact of the Soyuz capsule to the International Space Station.
Things have moved on since Phileas Fogg took 80 days to circumnavigate the globe. These days, the crew aboard the space station circle the planet once every hour and a half. Obviously, the first thing they'll have to get used to is weightlessness. As one astronaut said, "It feels like we're meant to fly." But the crew of the space station aren't really flying. They're falling with style, falling constantly towards the Earth and missing it by around 300 kilometers, which is what being in orbit actually means. As well as being great fun, this experience of weightlessness gives the astronauts real insight into how the world below got to be the way it is. Any liquid spilt on the space station starts off as a wobbly blob before magically drawing itself into a perfect sphere. The same thing will happen to any liquid that falls for long enough, and this is how the Earth was formed. 4.6 billion years ago, our planet was liquid. Nothing more than a giant blob of molten rock falling endlessly around the sun and missing it by 150 million kilometers. Our planet's surface has cooled and hardened, but the inside is still nearly as hot as the surface of the sun. The first stop on our westward journey around the world is Iceland. This is the best place to get a sense of our Earth's liquid past. Our planet is changing all the time, but in human terms it can be hard to see or understand. Iceland is part of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, a 10,000 kilometer fracture in the Earth's crust running down the center of the ocean. Most of this ridge is deep below the sea, making Iceland one of only a few places on the planet where you can get a sense of our world remaking itself. It is one of the fastest changing places on Earth. In the last 1,000 years, a third of the lava to reach the Earth's surface has emerged in Iceland. And because the land is being built faster than the sea can take it away, the islands are getting bigger all the time. Without the molten interior of the Earth to constantly create new land, there wouldn't be anywhere for us to live. The Earth would be a perfect sphere covered in water over a kilometer deep, falling endlessly around the sun. So volcanoes make our life possible. And the ones here are part of a massive system that have spent the last 180 million years making the world's newest ocean, the Atlantic. It may be growing slowly, but it is very definitely still growing. In the time it takes for the space station to orbit the planet, the Atlantic will have widened by 0.003 millimeters, which is about the same rate at which your fingernails grow. There is nothing unusual about the natural world changing. What is different now is that it's changing at a phenomenal rate. And the reason for this is us. And the next stop on our westward journey demonstrates exactly that. This is the Amazon rainforest in Brazil. There has been a rainforest here for 55 million years, but the most dramatic changes have taken place in the last 50 years. It seems that almost as soon as humans descended from the trees, we started chopping them down. Flint axes were some of the first tools invented. Since then, humans have spread around the world clearing the forests. It's something we've become extremely good at. The Amazon is being cleared at an astonishing rate, but only because humans are now super efficient at chopping down trees. In Northern Europe, clearing the bulk of our forests to make way for farming took about 500 years, but we'd undoubtedly have done it far quicker if we'd had chainsaws to speed the destruction along a bit. Of the hundreds of tree species in the Amazon, only about 30 to 50 have any commercial value. The rest are simply burnt to make way for agriculture. Yet, eventually, most countries do reach a point where they stop chopping down trees and start planting them again. A point that is known as the forest transition. In Europe and North America, this point was reached in the 19th century. Now forests there are expanding. One day this may happen in Brazil. But they're not there yet. And at the moment, each time the space station passes overhead, the Amazon will be 2.2 square kilometers smaller. That's about 270 football pitches to those of us who aren't farmers or property developers. It's easy to see what's happening to the Amazon, but in other places it's hard to spot change, let alone work out what has caused it. Greenland lies 10 degrees to the west and thousands of kilometers north. This is one of the Earth's most unforgiving landscapes, and the distances are vast. Trying to work out exactly what's happening up here is easier said than done. So scientists turned to space to get a better idea of what's going on. Between 2003 and 2007, a satellite was sent on an orbit over Greenland and the Arctic. 5 million laser measurements later, this revealed the thickness of the ice, the speed it's moving, and what is being added back through new snowfall. The results were rather gloomy. In the time it takes for the space station to complete one orbit of Earth, 54 million cubic meters of ice will melt away. That's enough to fill Wembley Stadium 14 times over. The fact that the world's ice sheets are melting pretty fast is no longer disputed, and the evidence suggests that this is down to the way we are behaving. But pointing this out is fast becoming one of the best ways to start a fight. The problem is complexity. There are just so many variables, so much to take into account. In fact, for all our zipping around in space, there are big chunks of our planet we barely understand. Take our next stop, home to the biggest lightning show on Earth. On up to 160 nights a year at Lake Maracaibo in Venezuela, a 5-kilometer-high tower of cloud forms over the lake, and lightning arcs back and forth for 10 hours at a time. But why does this happen? You'd have thought with something this spectacular, we'd be fairly sure. It's thought that weather fronts coming down from the Andes mix with methane gas rising off the marshy lake to create the perfect conditions for lightning. But this is just one of several theories. No one can categorically say why it's happening or why it occasionally stops altogether. Lightning strikes around 100 times a second, so in the course of one space station orbit, the Earth will be struck over 500,000 times. realize how hard it is to explain the lightning in one small area of South America, you can start to see how difficult predicting any kind of weather really is. We understand the underlying principles. The sun heats the atmosphere, and the chaotic release of this stored energy creates wind, clouds, rain, snow, hail, and everything else we call the weather. The problem begins when you try to put it all together to predict what's going to happen on a global scale. As our orbit swoops west, we come to the Gulf of Mexico, home to some of the most extreme weather on the planet. This is what a major storm looks like from space.
Storm just outside the eye wall. They are really getting hammered right now, and also winds possibly up to 50, 60, 70 miles an hour in Baton Rouge.
Why does this hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico happen? To answer that question with 100% certainty, you'd need a computer model that takes into account every possible variable, right down to a butterfly beating its wing on the other side of the world. It simply isn't possible. And yet the sheer power and energy of these storms dwarfs anything we are capable of. Every 2 seconds, a hurricane like this will release more energy than the atomic bomb which destroyed Hiroshima. But we still can't say with absolute certainty why it happens. Not all the storms the space station passes over are going to be this big.
Oh my God! Did you see that?
In the time it takes to complete one orbit, the space station will pass over 1,800 storms taking place somewhere around the planet. The space program is part of our attempt to fill in a few gaps in our knowledge and better understand the mysteries of our world. The research focuses on the effects of weightlessness on plants, animals, and the human body. If we can better understand this, then we can start thinking about taking the next step into space, trips to Mars and beyond. The crew themselves are a large part of the research program. It's amazing what can happen to their bodies up here. Without gravity pushing down on them, they grow by about 3 centimeters during a 6-month mission. But even for the astronauts, it's easy to forget how amazing this is. The incredible becomes the mundane very quickly. They may be in space, but the working week is still 8 till 5, Monday to Friday. Like everyone else in the human race, they end up just getting on with the job at hand, tiny cogs doing their bit for the incredibly complex machine that is human civilization. So perhaps we should take a moment to consider just what a bafflingly elaborate world we humans have created for ourselves. Take Chicago at 88 degrees west.
Hey! Did it!
97.9, The Loop, Chicago's rock station.
Sunshine and 80 this afternoon. Hello, North Avenue Beach. Take along the sunscreen if you're headed there or to see the White Sox take on the Cubs.
This is a teeming metropolis of nearly 10 million people, all absorbed in the minutiae of their daily lives. Getting to and from work, shopping for clothes, food, and the things they need to get through the day. Each one a worker bee, contributing their little bit to the hive. Chicago is also home to the largest commodities trading floor in the world. A bear pit of raw capitalism where bets are taken on the future prices of orange juice and steel, pork bellies and coal, apples and crude oil. These traders spend their day trying to predict the dizzying complexities of our economic system. A man in a silly jacket waves his hands and transforms a hectare of rainforest into toilet seats before a subprime mortgage flapping its wings on the other side of the world sends the whole lot into meltdown. we've taken something as simple as buying and selling stuff and turned it into a game that hardly any of us even understands anymore. And across the globe, the human worker bees of the world will generate $9.4 billion in the time the space station makes a single orbit. But it's not just the money markets that have changed. These days, many aspects of human life are enough to make your head spin. Even creating the humble beef burger has become an insanely complicated operation. The next stop on our orbit is Texas. This state produces over 14% of America's beef, so cattle probably have a better chance of making it into space than you do. Though, as they will be butchered, sterilized with ionizing radiation, then vacuum sealed in foil pouches before being blasted into orbit, they won't really be able to enjoy the trip. Humans used to be hunter-gatherers, but it was a huge bore constantly chasing your dinner around the wilderness. So in a stroke of total genius, we came up with the idea of farming, persuading animals to stay in one place while we milk them, pinch their eggs, or knock them on the head to put them in burgers. In some places, this simple idea has got a bit out of hand. Farming here takes place on such a vast scale that ranches like this have to use helicopters to round up the cattle. It's a testament to the power of thousands of years of domestication that cattle will even stand for this. Most animals would go berserk or drop down dead with fright if you chased them around in a chopper. And the price cattle pay for this compliance is that in the 90 minutes it takes to complete one orbit of the planet, 49,657 of them will be slaughtered to feed the human race. The space station sits at the end of the furthest tentacles of the same food distribution network that starts with cows in Texas. They get regular door-to-door deliveries aboard an unmanned probe called Progress.
Capture is confirmed.
These provisions cost more than their weight in gold to send into orbit, which makes this one of the most expensive meals in the history of dining. Apart from the chore of having to chase their supper around the room, the other thing many of the crew find is that spaceflight dampens the taste buds, so they like to keep a ready supply of spices on hand to give meals as much taste as possible. The ability to blast groceries into space may be impressive, but it's nothing compared to the absurd ways we apply our ingenuity back down on Earth. Consider the next stop on our westward orbit, Las Vegas. Most major settlements develop where crops will grow well or mineral resources are found in abundance. Others flourish near waterways or important trading routes. Las Vegas has none of these things. It was built slap bang in the middle of a desert, on the road to nowhere, and absolutely everything has to be shipped in. Las Vegas is a city where everything we've ever learned about where to build cities has been ignored to take advantage of our basic misunderstanding of the laws of chance. The ability to lose your life savings on the toss of a dice have turned it into the fastest growing city in America. This city is the crowning achievement of our ability to channel the world's resources wherever we want, however absurd this may be. It means this vast, expanding city consumes energy like an obese, beer-guzzling, burger-eating fatty. In fact, Vegas also happens to be the fattest city in the fattest country on Earth. But it gets more absurd still. Vegas is a crazy festival of excess running alongside a constant battle to stay thin and healthy. You sometimes just have to stop and marvel at what we've created. A city where food is shipped in at huge expense to be consumed in vast quantities before we scuttle off to expensive gyms to use machines that replicate the action of walking and picking things up. In one orbit of the space station, the human race will collectively spend over $62 million on dieting aids, while 1,562 people around the planet die of starvation. It's a crazy world of winners and losers. Like food, air is another thing it's easy to take for granted down on Earth. In space, it's a major preoccupation. Transporting all the necessary oxygen up to orbit would be bulky and very expensive. So the station has to generate its own breathable air. This is done by running an electrical current through water to split the oxygen out from the hydrogen, which the crew can then breathe. The air is then circulated through charcoal filters that remove carbon dioxide or other nasty gases that leak from the crew's bodies or from all the equipment on board. Sustaining an environment where 6 people can breathe freely is one thing. Over 6 billion people provide a far sterner test. The next stop on this orbit is Los Angeles, which has some of the worst air quality in the United States.
95.5.
Why shouldn't I sound great? I am great.
The Q rocks in HD.
It's brighter. It's crisper. It's new and improved.
LA started out at a distinct disadvantage. The name given by the Native Americans who lived here was the Valley of Smoke, because of the way their campfires caused smog that hung unnaturally in the air. An anomaly called atmospheric inversion that still traps thick blankets of pollution in the city today. In 2008, the city had the highest year-round particulate pollution in America. However, because air pollution does get trapped over the city, it has focused minds on reducing all dangerous emissions. Thanks to these remarkable efforts, Los Angeles now has the lowest per capita carbon emissions of any city in mainland USA. Nevertheless, in the time it will take to complete one circumnavigation, 5 million tons of carbon will be released into the atmosphere.
Tonight. And so the other concern that we have is that, we've been showing the video, of course, from the Industrial Canal. Well, we still have that, I talked to the National Weather Service forecasters over there. They have this.
Carbon in our atmosphere is currently running at its highest level for 800,000 years. Not that this is bad news for all living creatures. Life is particularly sweet if you're a tubular, gelatinous animal sieving the sea for phytoplankton. These salps live off the LA coast. They eat phytoplankton, which in turn consumes carbon. And when salps consume the plankton, they excrete the carbon as pellets, which sink to the ocean floor to be locked back into the earth. Usually, salps are a modest 10 centimeters long, so one salp doesn't make much difference. But when they need to, they can grow faster than any other animal. And when food becomes abundant, they clone themselves into huge swarms. These can contain trillions of individual salps, and cover up to 100,000 square kilometers of ocean. A swarm on that scale can send over 250 tons of carbon to the ocean floor every 90 minutes. Salps are one of the few winners as the world changes. For most species, the rapid change is a huge challenge.
And for the Maryhill bypass, just a little slow way to get through at United Boulevard. From News 1130, I'm Kim Jack.
The northwestern wilderness in Canada is hard to get to. There are no roads, and it's a long walk from the nearest permanent human settlement. It would be possible to spend days here with the illusion that 200,000 years of human history had never happened. But even in the midst of this apparent isolation, there are signs that something major is going on. Even here, species are struggling to cope with the way the Earth is changing. Animals like the Vancouver Island marmot and the swift fox. There are thought to be less than 1,000 of these black-footed ferrets left on the planet. Getting exact figures on the current rate of extinctions is an imprecise science. But conservative estimates are that we're losing about 6,000 species of animals and plants a year. Extinction is one of the facts of life. By looking back at the fossil record, you can work out what could be considered a normal rate of extinction. What we're experiencing now is at least 1,000 times this normal background rate. Which means we're approaching the same level of extinctions that saw off the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. Current thinking is that that round of extinctions was caused by an asteroid the size of Mount Everest crashing into the Earth at 54,000 kilometers per hour. What's happening now may feel less dramatic than that, but there is certainly something unpleasant going on. Different forms of life have waxed and waned many times over our planet's history, depending on whether conditions are right for them. That's the way nature works. If chopping down trees, raising stakes using helicopters, and building gin palaces in the desert is making life easier for gelatinous blobs in the sea and harder for polar bears and us, then nature will adapt accordingly. For in the time it takes to complete an orbit of the globe, one further species of animal or plant will have gone extinct somewhere in the world. As our orbit continues out into the vast expanse of the Pacific, you'd expect to leave behind all signs of the impact humans are having on the planet. Dotted across this ocean are places which have become a byword for earthly paradise. And none more so than the islands of Hawaii. There are sun-kissed beaches, wonderful surf, exotic wildlife, and dramatic volcanic landscapes. But unfortunately, stressed-out modern humans aren't the only thing arriving on these shores. It turns out that when we throw things away, quite often this is where away is. One small piece of rubbish thrown into the ocean doesn't seem to be a major problem. But over the past 100 years, all the small pieces have been drawn together by the Pacific currents to form a vast island of rubbish. And this floating rubbish dump now covers an area of ocean the size of the USA. The beaches on the southern islands of Hawaii are right in the path of this waterborne catastrophe. Indestructible rubbish is one of our most recent inventions. Plastic is made to last, and none of the plastic ever made has yet decomposed. Every yogurt pot, frisbee, and washing up bowl in creation is still out there somewhere, being broken down into smaller and smaller pieces. These tiny plastic particles may not be as easy to see as old bottles or discarded flip-flops, but their effects are devastating. As the pieces get smaller, marine birds start mistaking them for food. Their stomachs fill with indigestible material that stops them from eating. They starve to death while their stomachs are full. The plastic also breaks up into tiny microscopic pieces, and these get eaten by plankton and so enter the bottom of the food chain, gradually damaging the health of all species on the planet, which of course includes humans. In just one orbit of the Earth, the human race will throw away a further 273,972 tons of rubbish. Back on the space station, rubbish is one thing the crew need not worry about. It is jettisoned into space, where it burns up in the Earth's atmosphere. A highlight of any mission to the space station is taking part in a spacewalk. There can be few more extraordinary human experiences than this. The crew have the chance to look around and contemplate the incredible position in which they find themselves.
We're seeing correct motion up here physically.
Copy, and we see good numbers on the ground.
As we do up here.
Hey guys, we're getting awesome video now. Susan's looking at you out the lab window, but we're also seeing reflections of all the clouds go by, reflected in the lab window. Yeah, it's beautiful.
Yet without their $12 million spacesuits, the astronauts would simultaneously start to freeze, explode, and asphyxiate. Space is not a good place to live. It reminds you just how much our planet does to protect us. As they watch the sun set through their gold-plated visor, the astronauts will witness one amazing example of this protection in action. In the darkness, they will be able to see the northern and southern lights dancing around the poles. Earth is under a constant bombardment of highly charged plasma escaping from the surface of the sun. We are protected from this solar wind by a magnetic field extending out from the poles to envelop the planet in a protective bubble. The flickering illumination of the northern and southern lights are the edges of this magnetic field at work. Without it, Earth would be about as habitable as a golf ball in a microwave oven. It's yet another thing that makes life on our planet possible. These plasma rays are not the only thing buffeting Earth from space. The Earth's atmosphere also shields us from an incessant and lethal bombardment. On any clear night, shooting stars can be seen streaking across the heavens. These are meteorites hurtling towards Earth and burning up as they crash into the atmosphere. Just a few small particles manage to hit the ground. But this still adds up. In the time it takes for the space station to make one orbit, Earth will have gained around 342 kilos from material hitting it from space. A little bit more than the weight of 2 sumo wrestlers. But our species hasn't just survived on planet Earth, we have positively flourished. In just 10,000 generations, we've progressed at an ever-increasing rate from loincloths and pointy sticks to spacesuits. This amazing ability to innovate has served our species very nicely, and it's what we're going to rely on if we're going to meet the challenges of the future. And if you want to see where innovation comes from, then you need look no further than our next stop, the land of the rising sun, Japan. If you want to succeed, you have to build on the success of those that have gone before. And we humans have succeeded thanks to one thing which has raised us above all other species. Education, mankind's extraordinary ability to learn, innovate, and pass on knowledge. Japan has one of the best education systems in the world. It's often credited as being the secret of its great success. These children are acquiring the basic skill which makes all other human achievements possible: language. For an individual child, learning to read and write is a way of getting a better job, leading a more interesting life, and generally taking advantage of everything the world has to offer. But for the human race, reading and writing is how we continually build on 50 centuries of accumulated knowledge. It saves a huge amount of time if you don't have to reinvent the wheel or prove that the Earth is round every generation. Language is the prime reason the human race has managed to become so successful. The average 7-year-old learns up to 20 words a day. So for every orbit of the space station, the next generation of astronauts and philosophers will have learnt one new word. Standing on the shoulders of those who have gone before, that's how to build a society that can achieve great things. After language, it is mankind's ability to create tools that has marked out our dominance. And the most powerful, most adaptable tool we have yet created is the computer. You would expect the space station to be bristling with computers. But what may surprise you is that the computers up here are far slower than the average desktop PC back on Earth. It is more important for these computers to be stable than fast. A computer crash on Earth is annoying. The same error here could be catastrophic. This certainly wouldn't go down very well at our next stop on our journey west around the planet. South Korea is flourishing by building on the accomplishments of others. In the 1960s, South Korea had a level of national wealth on a par with Afghanistan. Now it is the 13th richest country in the world. The key to this is the computer. South Korea is techno-crazy. They may not have invented the microchip, the television, or the telephone, but that doesn't matter because they've picked up the baton of human ingenuity and they are running with it as fast as they can. They now lead the way in the design and manufacture of the sparkly new gadgets we all love to play with. It's easy to forget that the computer is simply a tool, the latest stage in thousands of years of innovation and refinement that stretches back to the moment the first piece of rock was turned into an axe. Like everything else, this process is accelerating almost too fast to keep up with. The computers installed in the first spacecraft to reach the moon are now easily outclassed by most mobile phones. But just as our ingenuity created the computers that got us into space, we're just as capable of using such wonderful tools in absurd ways. Like running off to a fantasy universe to slaughter aliens. The streets of Seoul are lined with PC bangs, gaming cafes where the young gather to wage endless war across virtual battlefields. Whilst in most countries, stadiums are full of people watching football or tennis, in South Korea, computer games are a major spectator sport. Who, 50 years ago, would have imagined that chasing coloured dots across a screen and hammering a plastic button till you develop arthritis could be so compelling? When humans first went to space, the number of computers in the world could be counted in the hundreds. There are now over 1 billion of them on the planet. In the time it takes the space station to complete one orbit, we will be joined on planet Earth by a further 49,144 computers. The space station is traveling at a speed of 28,000 kilometers per hour. At this speed, even dust-sized grains of debris become lethal projectiles. So the space station has to be heavily protected. Its outer skin is made of aluminium, but stretched over this is a protective skin of Kevlar and ceramic, exactly the same materials used in bulletproof vests. The rest of the internal structure is there to stop the space station from blowing apart. The pressure inside the space station is many times greater than the emptiness of space surrounding it. For this strength, the space station relies on high-grade steel. The steel is, of course, made from iron, the most widely used raw material on the planet. And much of this iron will have come from a place like this.
The station orbiting 240 statute miles over just to the north of Australia.
It's 96 FM.
With great classics and the best of the 80s, 90s, and now.
This is Mount Whaleback Mine in Western Australia. It is the biggest single-pit iron ore mine in the world. Every car, fridge and space station started out as rubble in the bottom of a hole like this. In the past 5 years, iron ore production worldwide has doubled. The same holds true for many other things we dig or pump out of the ground. Iron makes up about 5% of our planet, so there is little danger of it running out anytime soon. But some very familiar materials will not be around very much longer. At current consumption rates, some experts predict that within the next 2 generations, we will have worked our way through all known reserves of gold, silver and lead. Meanwhile, the world will carry on chomping its way through iron ore at an astonishing rate. Every 90 minutes, the human race will dig up a further 350,000 tons of the stuff. The pace at which our planet is transforming is breathtaking. As we travel further west, we reach China, where the speed of change reverberates around the entire planet. 50 years ago, China had a rural economy based on farming. Now it is well on the way to becoming the world's leading manufacturing nation. More than a quarter of everything made on Earth is produced in China. Everything we know about how to harness the world's resources and turn them into wealth is being applied in China on an epic scale and at breakneck speed. And it works. 40 years ago, over 50% of the population were living in poverty. Now less than 10% are. Who can blame the Chinese for wanting the lives we in the West enjoy? But with 1.4 billion people craving new, supersized lifestyles, their use of energy and raw materials is skyrocketing. China is building enough power stations to increase their generating capacity by more than the entire UK power grid every year. This might seem like a lot, but per capita, people here still use far less energy than those in Europe or America. But the pits that fuel an economic miracle like this aren't bottomless. Perhaps the answer lies with the space station cruising overhead. It draws all its power needs directly from the sun. Its giant solar panels house 2,500 square meters of photovoltaic cells that are constantly turning to make best use of the sun's energy. The system is so powerful, it could provide enough electricity for a village of over 50 houses. Our orbit over Asia has so far shown us the beauty of language, wondrous tools, the raw materials we build with, and our ability to master energy. But what of that first, seemingly simplest of human inventions, the wheel? We are now hurtling over Thailand.
Radio Bangkok.
สวัสดีค่ะคุณกำลังฟัง Radio Bangkok ดิฉันดีเจมุกเราจะจัดเตรียมบทเพลงเพราะๆให้คุณตลอด 24 ชั่วโมง
When you think of Thailand, you might imagine white sand beaches and crystal water. But this is the place in Asia where mankind now builds the wheel. Welcome to Bangkok, the Detroit of the Far East. Each individual car is the meeting point for a planet-wide system of mineral extraction, manufacturing, and technical know-how. The result is an object more intricately constructed than a Fabergé egg. Everyone loves their car, and why not? They give freedom, independence, a dashing sense of joie de vivre. For many people, the first car is a rite of passage, allowing the new owner to spread their wings and fly the nest. The car, which is such a fantastic thing for each of us to own individually, only really becomes a problem when we all get together. There are currently around 800 million cars in the world. But as people in developing countries realize they could have one too, this number is set to explode. If car ownership around the world reaches levels similar to those in America, the number of cars on the planet will be 4.8 billion. Whilst the only slightly more fabulous space station makes its way once around the planet, 12,076 new cars will roll off the production lines around the world. The unstoppable rise of the machines continues. We live on a shining oasis floating in a vast desert of nothing. One thing that is clear from space is that whoever came up with the name Earth was an idiot. Only a third is Earth. The rest is water. And on the next stop on our orbit, you'd think that water would never run out. Cherrapunji in northern India. It is the wettest place on the planet. Cherrapunji sits in the hills above the plains of Bangladesh. This high ground is the first obstacle in the path of the monsoon that sweeps in heavy with moisture gathered up from the Bay of Bengal. There are monsoons in various places around the world, but the biggest and most powerful are those which cross the Indian subcontinent. As the clouds reach the hills around Cherrapunji, they are forced upwards with astonishing results. Moisture gathered over thousands of kilometers is suddenly released. Rainfall here can measure over 12 meters a year. It can rain all year round. Some locals claim that it once poured down for 2 years without a break. These deluges are not without their problems. Many of the trees that used to cover these hills have been cleared to make way for farming, allowing the monsoon to wash away much of the topsoil. The ground can no longer absorb the water, and most of it pours off the hills down onto the plains of Bangladesh below, a country already under constant threat of flooding. Whether it's raining or not in Cherrapunji, it will certainly be lashing it down somewhere around the world right at this moment. During each and every orbit of the space station, 81.6 trillion litres of rain will fall on the planet. But when the nearest tap, or even rain cloud, is 300 kilometers below on the planet's surface, you need no reminding of how precious fresh water is. Every drop the astronauts drink will be filtered and reused hundreds of times during each mission, and I do mean every drop. Living up here on the space station, the crew have no choice but to share and conserve water. It's a lesson we could do with taking more notice of down on Earth. Because down here, our attempts to share out the world's water supply can go spectacularly wrong. Take the Aral Sea in Kazakhstan.
Сколько раз я летал во сне? Каждую субботу в 3 часа дня. В эфире FM.
When Yuri Gagarin first went into space 50 years ago, this was the 4th largest freshwater lake in the world. But during the 1960s, the Soviet Union decided to divert the waters that fed the sea to irrigate the deserts south of here. They knew this would drain the Aral Sea, but that was okay. They had a plan. A 2,500-kilometer canal was to be blasted down from Siberia using nuclear explosives. This would provide the water to refill the sea. Just 3 of the planned 250 nuclear explosions were carried out before the whole plan ground to a halt for want of money. In the 1990s, it was cancelled altogether, and soon after that, the Soviet Union itself ceased to exist. The Aral Sea is now a swirling cloud of dust and salt, heavily contaminated with agricultural chemicals. Kazakhstan's inhabitants wait in vain for an empire that no longer exists to build a trans-Siberian canal that no one could afford in the first place. During every orbit of the space station, 34 square kilometers of land, an area the size of Dubai, will become desert somewhere on the planet thanks to our chronic water mismanagement. And as the desert spread, we're moving on from simply diverting water to fighting over it. Just what we need. Something else to have a war about. One of the absurd results of our technical genius is that we've devised some wonderfully elaborate ways of destroying each other. Cruising through the Persian Gulf is the USS Nimitz. This is one of the largest warships in the world. It's like a floating Las Vegas, but dedicated to destruction. She stands over 23 stories tall with a complement of 90 jets and helicopters. For these aircraft to drop a set of bombs, a vast machine kicks into action. This ship is a floating city of over 5,000 men and women. From air traffic control to firemen, cooks to gunners, pilots to cleaners, all of whom need feeding and entertaining. But as they sail through the balmy waters of the Persian Gulf, the vast majority of the crew hardly ever see daylight. The flight deck is far too dangerous to have people wandering around. So those not directly involved in flying spend months on end living deep within the bowels of this gigantic steel tank. The galleys produce 20,000 meals a day. The ship has a library, a 53-bed hospital, 6 doctors, 5 dentists, and a general surgeon. And of course, huge stockpiles of weaponry and military hardware. While the ship herself is nuclear powered, so can sail for 20 years without refueling. This ship sits at the apex of military power, but being the toughest kid on the block doesn't come cheap. During the time it will take to complete a circumnavigation of the globe, governments around the world will spend $257 million on the military, the sum of all our fears. In many ways, the small community on the space station mirrors that found back on Earth. They have found ways to feed themselves, provide power, ensure a ready supply of clean air and water. Although thankfully so far there are no reports of any fights. But in one very fundamental way, planet Earth is absolutely unique. No human being has ever been born anywhere in the universe but down there. Our westward orbit has brought us to Africa. This is part of the Rift Valley, a crack running through the heart of Ethiopia. This is where humankind started out. We walked out of here across the globe and ended up walking in space in just 10,000 generations. Scientists think that 160,000 years ago, there lived a woman somewhere along this valley who is the common ancestor of everyone alive today. Unsurprisingly, they have named her Eve. No remains of Eve will ever be found, Nevertheless, each one of us carries round the evidence she existed inside us. Our cells contain tiny structures called mitochondria. Mitochondria have their own DNA, which you inherited from your mother, as she did from hers. Plotting the changes in this DNA has led scientists back 8,000 generations to the common female ancestor of everyone alive today. And it's thought that she would have lived near here. So children born at this maternity hospital in Ethiopia today could theoretically trace their family tree back some 8,000 generations to a woman who lived her life very close to this spot. In the time it takes for the space station to orbit once, there will be 23,019 children born around the world. 23,019 bundles of joy that will carry on the crazy, fun-filled journey we're all part of. So what does 90 minutes mean to one of these human beings? For a newborn baby, changes are happening fast. In 90 minutes, their brains will make 9.5 billion synaptic connections, literally piecing together all the information they're taking in about the world around them. As humans grow older, this process slows down and then slowly goes into reverse. A fully grown adult will lose 5,000 such connections every 90 minutes as the brain quietly prunes back the least used connections. An average human will breathe 1,438 times in 90 minutes, taking in enough air to fill about 450 balloons. This oxygen will be picked up by the 12.5 billion red blood cells newly created each 90 minutes to be transported around the body, a journey of around 1,187 kilometers. It will have been powered on this journey by the heart, which will have pumped around 10,000 times to keep the blood continually flowing. For the crew of the space station, their time in orbit will be far harder on the body than you might imagine. The lack of gravity has an almost immediate effect on muscles. They start to diminish within days, and long-term stays in space can lead to a 40% reduction in muscles function. The crew have to work hard on their fitness to try and overcome this. Bones also start to lose their density by as much as 1 to 2% a week, which is as much as a person on Earth might lose in a year. Despite these effects on the human body, no one has ever died in space itself. However, 22 people have been killed on the ground and during takeoff, or whilst re-entering the Earth's atmosphere. Amongst those who died were these astronauts, who were part of the crew of Space Shuttle Columbia, returning from a visit to the International Space Station. These 22 deaths represent a shocking 5% of all those who've been given the chance to go into space. How long each of us will have on Earth is largely a matter of luck. Luck in the genes we inherit, luck in the diseases we're exposed to, luck in avoiding accidents, and luck in which country we're born in. As our journey brings us to the line of longitude that passes through both Scandinavia and southern Africa, the contrast couldn't be starker.
Nya singeln Bad Romance dyker upp efter nyheterna. Upplev de hetaste artisterna.
At the southern end of this line of longitude lies Angola. Angola was engaged in civil war for most of the past 30 years. Services here are basic to non-existent. The country is littered with the detritus of war, including millions of landmines. 1 in 6 children here will not live to see their first birthday. If you're born in Angola, you can expect to live for 42 years. At the northern end of the line lies Sweden, one of the most stable, prosperous and healthy nations in the world. People lucky enough to be born here can expect to live longer than nearly anyone else in the world. The average Swede will live to be over 80 years old. So a Swedish person can expect to live nearly twice as long as someone born in Angola. Since Yuri Gagarin first ventured into space, average life expectancy around the world has risen by about 10 years. A giant leap in such a short space of time. And every year, as more and more countries grow and develop, life expectancy around the world goes up and up. We are pushing back the boundaries of life as our species gets stronger and stronger. This is the true genius of the human race. During the time it takes to complete one orbit of the planet, just 9,696 people will die. During their 6 months aboard the space station, the crew will orbit the globe 3,000 times before their mission is complete. But Earth is our home, and no matter how amazing space travel may be, they will eventually want to head back to rejoin the rest of humanity.
We copy.
Fewer than 200 people have had the privilege of living on the International Space Station. For each of them, it will be one of the defining experiences of their lives. Perhaps they will return to live in a town like this, the last stop on our orbit around the planet. This is the town of Provence, near Paris. Like everywhere else on the planet, the people of Provence will have been largely unaware of the space station orbiting overhead. They will have been heading out to work or shopping for the goods we produce and consume. Others will have spent the time eating and drinking, or just enjoying the company of their friends. Their children will have been at school. Someone in the town may have died, whilst others will have been born. But around the world, as the average life now lasts so much longer than it used to, the world's population is growing. Since the space station last passed overhead, you now share the planet with an extra 13,323 people, which is almost exactly the population of Provence. Enough new people to populate this town every time the space station passes overhead. It is a sobering thought that in the 50 years since mankind first went into space, the world's population has doubled. Human history may be 10,000 generations long, but almost everything we know about how the world changes and how we may be changing it have been learned in the 2 generations we've been watching ourselves from space. Finding out the Earth was blue may have been amazing, but seeing our planet looking so isolated and fragile has had a far more profound impact. This may turn out to be the lasting legacy of the space program. As one astronaut put it, NASA doesn't tend to employ many philosophers, but everyone that they send up soon becomes one. Our species may do some fairly daft things from time to time, but we are also capable of achieving greatness. And we inhabit by far the most appealing piece of real estate in the known universe. Surely keeping it that way isn't beyond us. All 6.8 billion of us. And counting.
She is an alien.
Starting next Wednesday, 7:30.
I don't care.
You will.
Hurry up! Back it up!
Shut up and listen to me.
Do you think you were a good representation for Australia this morning?
Why are you determined to destroy yourself?
7's amazing new series of World's Strictest Parents. Next Wednesday, 7:30.